What the bustling patrons of the Homestead Café couldn't possibly know was that the frail woman sitting alone in the corner booth had once been the most feared operative in covert military operations. Beatrice Thornwood's weathered hands, now trembling slightly as they wrapped around a cheap ceramic mug, had once defused bombs under enemy fire and coordinated extractions that saved hundreds of lives. The words she would speak later that morning would stop a decorated colonel dead in his tracks and reveal a legacy that had remained buried in classified files for over 5 decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November morning air carried the sharp bite of early winter through Clearwater, Idaho, a small town where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Beatrice Thornwood had lived here for 32 years, yet she remained largely invisible to most residents. At 79 years old, she moved through the world with the quiet deliberation of someone who had learned long ago that drawing attention can mean the difference between life and death. She had chosen the Homestead Café for her annual Veterans Day breakfast for reasons that went deeper than its convenient location on Maple Street. The cafe occupied the exact spot where a general store had once stood, the same store her friend Garrett had shown her in a faded photograph during a brief respite between missions in 1968. Best apple pie in Idaho, he'd promised with that easy grin of his. When this is over, we'll get a whole pie and eat it on the porch. That promise, like so many others made in the chaos of war, had never been fulfilled. Beatrice's appearance offered no hint of her extraordinary past. She wore a simple gray cardigan that had seen better days, its elbows worn thin from years of use. Her white hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face, deeply lined by time and memory, seemed unremarkable to the casual observer. But those who looked closely, really looked, might have noticed the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, tracking entrances and exits with practiced efficiency. They might have seen how she positioned herself with her back to the wall, maintaining a clear line of sight to the door. Old habits, forged in circumstances most people couldn't imagine, never truly died. The cafe buzzed with the comfortable chaos of a Tuesday morning. Families gathered around tables laden with pancakes and bacon. Business people typed urgently on laptops while gulping coffee. A group of high school students clustered near the counter, their laughter rising above the general din. Life, vibrant and immediate, swirled around Beatrice like a river flowing past a stone. She ordered the same thing every Veterans Day, black coffee and a single piece of toast, not because of financial constraints, although her modest military pension certainly didn't allow for extravagance, but because the simplicity of the meal felt appropriate for what this day represented. It wasn't a celebration. It was a remembrance, a private ceremony of one, honoring those who never made it home. On her left wrist, barely visible beneath the edge of her cardigan sleeve, was a tattoo that few people ever saw. The design was unusual, a stylized phantom silhouette with the number 7 incorporated into its form. To the uninitiated, it might have seemed like an odd artistic choice from her youth. But to those who knew, truly knew, it was a mark that commanded instant recognition and profound respect. Beatrice had been part of something that officially didn't exist. Phantom 7 was a designation so classified that even most high-ranking military officials had never heard of it. The unit operated in the shadows of the Vietnam War, conducting missions that were too sensitive, too dangerous, or too politically complicated for conventional forces. They were ghosts, moving through enemy territory with objectives that would never appear in any public record. She had been one of only 3 women ever selected for the program, chosen not despite her gender, but because of capabilities that transcended such considerations. Her small stature allowed her to move through spaces larger operatives couldn't navigate. Her ability to blend into local populations proved invaluable for intelligence gathering, and her mind, sharp and analytical, could process complex tactical situations with remarkable speed and accuracy. But that was a lifetime ago. Now, she was simply the quiet old woman who lived in the small house on Birch Avenue, the one who kept to herself and occasionally volunteered at the library. Her neighbors knew she was a veteran, if they thought about it at all, but assumed she'd served in some administrative capacity. Women in combat roles were still relatively rare, and in her era, they were nearly unheard of. It was easier for people to imagine her filing paperwork than defusing explosives. As Beatrice lifted her coffee cup, a small tremor in her hand caused the liquid to ripple. Parkinson's disease, diagnosed 3 years ago, was slowly eroding her physical capabilities. The same hands that had once possessed rock-steady precision now betrayed her with involuntary movements. It was a cruel irony that someone who had survived enemy fire and impossible odds would be undone by her own nervous system. Across the cafe, a group of 4 men in their 50s occupied a large table near the window. They were regulars, local contractors who met here every Tuesday to discuss projects and exchange gossip. This morning, their conversation had turned to Veterans Day and the various people they knew who had served. "See that old lady over there?" one of them said, gesturing subtly toward Beatrice with his coffee cup. His name was Randy, a man whose confidence far exceeded his actual knowledge about most subjects. "Comes in here every Veterans Day, sits alone, orders the cheapest thing on the menu, probably trying to get the veterans discount." His companion, a heavyset man named Mitchell, glanced over. "Does she even qualify? I mean, what did women do back then? Nursing, maybe?" "If that," Randy scoffed. "My dad was in Nam. He said women stayed stateside, answering phones and typing letters. This participation trophy generation wants to act like everybody's a hero." The third man, quieter than the others, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we shouldn't assume." "Oh, come on, Derek," Randy continued, warming to his subject. "Look at her. She's what, 80? Barely keeping it together. Probably never saw a day of real action in her life." Beatrice heard every word. Her hearing, unlike her hands, remained sharp. She had learned long ago to filter the ambient noise of any environment and focus on specific conversations. It was a skill that had saved her life more than once, and it persisted even when she had no use for it. The words didn't anger her. She had endured far worse than the casual dismissal of ignorant men. What she felt instead was a familiar weariness, a bone-deep fatigue that came from carrying secrets and sacrifices that could never be shared. How could she explain to people like Randy that she had once crawled through tunnel systems rigged with explosives, her heartbeat the only sound in the suffocating darkness? How could she make them understand the weight of coordinating extraction operations while under enemy fire, knowing that every decision meant life or death for people depending on her? She couldn't, so she didn't try. Beatrice simply took another sip of her coffee and returned her gaze to the window, where the American flags lining Main Street snapped in the cold wind. Iris Pembroke, the young waitress working the morning shift, approached Beatrice's table with a fresh pot of coffee. Iris was 23, working her way through community college while trying to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. She had always been kind to Beatrice, offering smiles and small talk that the older woman appreciated more than Iris probably realized. "Can I warm that up for you, Miss Thornwood?" Iris asked, her voice friendly but slightly distracted. The cafe was busier than usual, and she was juggling multiple tables. "Thank you, dear," Beatrice replied softly. Her voice, like everything else about her, was unassuming. There was no hint of the authority she had once wielded, no echo of the commands she had given in life-or-death situations. As Iris poured, Randy's voice carried across the cafe once again. "I'm just saying, real veterans don't make a show of it. They join the VFW, they wear their caps, they connect with other vets. Sitting alone in a cafe, that's just looking for attention." This time, Iris heard him. Her expression tightened, and she glanced at Beatrice, who gave her a nearly imperceptible shake of the head. "Don't engage. It's not worth it." but the manager, unfortunately, had also heard it. Dennis Hartford was a man who prided himself on running a respectable establishment. He was community-minded, always sponsoring local sports teams and hanging patriotic decorations for appropriate holidays. But he was also concerned with appearances and customer satisfaction, particularly when it came to his regular, paying customers. He approached Beatrice's table with an apologetic expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Thornwood, I'm terribly sorry, but we're getting quite busy this morning. Would you mind terribly moving to one of the smaller tables? Perhaps the one by the kitchen? It would help us accommodate some of our larger parties." The request was phrased politely, but its meaning was clear. The men at the window table, who spent considerably more money and came in far more frequently, had complained about the elderly woman taking up a booth meant for 4 people. Dennis was choosing his constituency. Beatrice looked up at Dennis Hartford with those pale blue eyes that had once assessed threat levels in hostile territory. For a moment, something flickered in her gaze, a flash of the woman she used to be, the one who had commanded respect through competence rather than rank. But it passed quickly, replaced by the resigned acceptance of someone who had learned that battles must be chosen carefully, and this wasn't one worth fighting. "Of course," she said quietly, already gathering her coffee cup and the small plate holding her half-eaten toast. "I understand completely." Iris, still standing nearby with the coffee pot, looked stricken. "Miss Thornwood, you don't have to move. I can—" "It's fine, dear," Beatrice interrupted gently, offering the young woman a reassuring smile that cost her more effort than Iris would ever know. "I was just finishing anyway." Dennis, relieved that there would be no confrontation, gestured toward a small 2-person table wedged between the kitchen door and the restroom hallway. It was the least desirable spot in the entire cafe, a location where the constant traffic of servers and customers created a perpetual disturbance. The table itself was smaller than standard, its surface scarred by years of use, and it wobbled slightly when weight was applied. "That table there should work perfectly," Dennis said, his tone suggesting this was somehow doing Beatrice a favor. Much cozier, really. The walk from her booth to the assigned table was only about 20 feet, but it felt much longer. Beatrice moved slowly, not from any desire to make a scene, but because her body simply couldn't move quickly anymore. The Parkinson's affected her gait, causing a slight shuffle she had learned to manage, but couldn't entirely eliminate. Her left hand, carrying the coffee cup, trembled noticeably, and she had to concentrate to avoid spilling the dark liquid. She was acutely aware of the eyes tracking her movement. Some watched with curiosity, others with barely concealed pity, and a few, like Randy and his companions, with a mixture of satisfaction and contempt. This was the validation they needed for their earlier commentary. "See, she's barely capable of walking across the room. What kind of veteran could she possibly have been?" A young mother with 2 small children glanced at Beatrice, and then quickly looked away. The universal gesture of someone who has noticed something uncomfortable and chosen to pretend they haven't. One of the children, a little girl no more than 5 years old, stared openly, with the honest curiosity of the very young. "Mommy, why is that lady shaking?" the child asked in a voice that carried across the suddenly quieter cafe. "Shh, honey," the mother whispered urgently, her face flushing with embarrassment. "It's not polite to stare." Beatrice offered the child a small smile as she passed. She bore no ill will toward the innocent question. Children, at least, were honest in their curiosity rather than cruel in their judgment. Reaching the small table by the kitchen, Beatrice carefully set down her coffee and plate. The table did indeed wobble, causing the coffee to slosh dangerously close to the rim of the cup. She used a folded napkin to stabilize one of the legs, a practiced movement that spoke to someone accustomed to making do with imperfect circumstances. The location was everything Dennis had implied it would be, and worse. Every time the kitchen door swung open, it created a gust of warm air heavy with the smell of cooking grease. The constant traffic of servers moving between the dining room and kitchen created an almost hypnotic rhythm of near collisions and muttered "excuse me's." And the proximity to the restroom hallway meant a steady stream of customers passing within inches of her table, some glancing down at her with brief curiosity before continuing on their way. Beatrice settled into the uncomfortable metal chair and tried to reclaim some of the quiet contemplation she had been seeking when she first arrived that morning. But the moment, if there had ever truly been one, was irretrievably lost. This was no longer a memorial breakfast honoring fallen friends. It had become something else entirely, a stark reminder of her diminished place in a world that had moved on without her. She thought of Garrett, as she always did on this day, but the memories felt more distant now, harder to reach through the noise and indignity of her current situation. Garrett Thornwood had been her brother, though they looked nothing alike. She had been small and dark-haired, he tall and blonde, but they had shared something deeper than blood, an absolute commitment to the mission and to each other.
In the suffocating humility of a Vietnamese jungle, with hostile forces closing in, and their extraction helicopter taking fire, Garrett had made a choice. There was room for only 3 people in the first lift, and 4 operatives needed rescue. He had physically pushed Beatrice toward the helicopter while he provided covering fire, buying time for the aircraft to get clear. "You're more important to the mission," he had shouted over the roar of the helicopter blades and the crack of gunfire. "Tell Mom I love her." Those were the last words she ever heard him speak. The second helicopter, the one that was supposed to come back for him and the communications specialist who had stayed with him, never made it. Enemy fire had taken out its tail rotor 3 miles from the landing zone. By the time a third rescue attempt could be mounted, Garrett and the specialist, a young man named Chen, whose first name Beatrice had never learned, were gone. For 57 years, she had carried the weight of that moment. The guilt of surviving when others hadn't. The knowledge that her brother's final act had been to save her life at the cost of his own. And now, here she sat in a cafe that occupied the space where he had dreamed of eating pie, relegated to the worst table in the establishment because her presence was inconvenient. The kitchen door swung open again, nearly hitting Beatrice's shoulder. A young line cook, focused on the tray of food he was carrying, barely registered her presence. "Sorry," he muttered automatically, not even looking at her as he hurried past. Beatrice pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, suddenly feeling cold despite the waves of heat emanating from the kitchen. She glanced at her coffee, now cooling rapidly in the frequently open-door drafts, and decided she wasn't thirsty anymore. The toast on her plate had become unappetizing, the butter congealing in uneven patches. From her new vantage point, she could see Randy and his friends at their window table, now joined by a 5th man who had just arrived. They were laughing about something, their body language relaxed and comfortable. They belonged here in a way that Beatrice apparently did not. They were welcome. She was tolerated at best. Iris appeared at her elbow, looking genuinely distressed. "Miss Thornwood, I'm so sorry. I had no idea Dennis was going to do that. If I'd known—" "You would have done exactly what you did, dear. You're a good person, Iris, but you can't fight every battle for everyone else. You have to pick your moments." "But it's not right," Iris insisted, her voice dropping to an angry whisper. "You come in here every year. You're always polite and respectful, and they treat you like an inconvenience," Beatrice finished for her. "I know, but I've been treated worse, and I've survived it. This is just another day." Iris looked like she wanted to say more, but a sharp call from Dennis sent her hurrying back to her other tables. Beatrice watched her go, appreciating the young woman's indignation, even as she recognized its futility. The cafe continued its bustling morning routine around her, life and energy flowing past the small table where Beatrice sat in her imposed isolation. She had survived enemy interrogations, jungle diseases, and missions that should have been impossible. But somehow, this casual dismissal, this thoughtless relegation to the margins, felt like a different kind of defeat. She wrapped her trembling fingers around the lukewarm coffee cup and stared at the small window visible from her new position. Through it, she could see a narrow slice of Main Street and the American flags hanging from the old-fashioned street lamps. They rippled in the wind, red and white stripes alternating with the blue field of stars. The same flag that had draped Garrett's coffin when it finally came home 3 months after his death. Beatrice closed her eyes briefly, shutting out the cafe and its casual cruelties, retreating into memories that, while painful, at least honored the truth of who she had been and what she had sacrificed. In that interior space, she wasn't an inconvenient old woman taking up valuable real estate. She was Phantom 7, the operative who had completed 17 classified missions, saved countless lives, and earned decorations that remained locked in secure facilities because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging operations that officially never occurred. When she opened her eyes again, the cafe was still there, and so was her unwelcome table by the kitchen door. But something had shifted inside her, a small stiffening of resolve. She would finish her toast and coffee, no matter how unappetizing they had become. She would honor Garrett's memory, despite the indignity of her surroundings, and then she would leave, return to her small house on Birch Avenue, and continue living the quiet life she had built from the ashes of her extraordinary past.
The kitchen door swung open once more, and this time a server backed through it carrying a large tray of breakfast plates. The edge of the tray passed so close to Beatrice's head that she instinctively ducked, a movement born from reflexes honed in combat zones, where awareness of your surroundings meant survival. "Watch it," another server called out sharply, though it was unclear whether the warning was meant for Beatrice or the tray-carrying colleague. Beatrice steadied herself and took a deliberate bite of her cold toast. The butter had completely solidified now, forming an unappetizing film across the bread's surface. She chewed mechanically, tasting nothing, simply going through the motions because giving up felt like a greater defeat than enduring this humiliation. Her mind drifted back to 1967, to the sweltering heat of Saigon and the nondescript building where Phantom 7 had been recruited and trained. She remembered the skeptical faces of the male candidates when she and the 2 other women had entered the briefing room. The assumption had been clear in their expressions. These women were secretaries, perhaps translators, certainly not candidates for the same program. Colonel Harrison Webb, the man who had founded Phantom 7, had addressed that assumption immediately. "Some of you are wondering why we have women in this room," he had said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who never needed to shout. "Let me be clear. They're here because they're the best candidates for specific mission parameters: size, language skills, cultural adaptability, and psychological resilience. If you have a problem with that, the door is behind you." No one had left, and within 3 weeks of brutal training, Beatrice had proven herself more capable than half the men in the program. Her small frame allowed her to navigate tunnel systems and narrow passages that larger operatives couldn't access. Her fluency in Vietnamese and French made her invaluable for intelligence gathering, and her ability to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when chaos erupted around her, marked her as exceptional even among an exceptional group. Garrett had been so proud when she made the final selection. "My little sister, saving the world one classified mission at a time," he joked during one of their rare moments together between deployments. "Just promise me you'll be careful out there." She had promised. And she had been careful, but careful only went so far when you were operating behind enemy lines with objectives that changed by the hour and support that couldn't be guaranteed. The memory of one particular mission surfaced unbidden. November 1968, almost exactly 57 years ago.
She and Garrett had been part of a team tasked with extracting a high-value intelligence asset from a village that had fallen under enemy control. The asset, a South Vietnamese colonel, who had been passing critical information to American forces, had been compromised and was hours away from execution. The extraction plan was straightforward on paper. Infiltrate at night, locate the asset, and extract via helicopter from a clearing 2 miles from the village. But nothing was ever straightforward in reality. The village had been more heavily guarded than intelligence suggested. The colonel had been held in a reinforced structure rather than the civilian house they expected. And worst of all, their presence had been detected within minutes of entering the village perimeter. What followed had been 3 hours of urban combat, moving through narrow streets and between buildings while hostile forces closed in from all sides. Beatrice had been responsible for navigating the team through the village layout while simultaneously coordinating with their aerial support. Garrett had handled communications with their base, calling in covering fire and updating their extraction coordinates as the situation evolved. They had gotten the colonel out. All 12 members of the team had made it to the extraction point and boarded the helicopters. The mission had been classified as a success, and Beatrice had received a commendation that remained locked in a classified file somewhere in Washington, D.C. But the cost of that success stayed with her. The faces of the 3 South Vietnamese civilians caught in crossfire. The young enemy soldier, barely 18, who she had been forced to shoot when he stumbled upon their position. The weight of decisions made in split seconds, decisions that meant life for some and death for others.
These were the memories that visited her in the quiet hours before dawn, the ghosts that no amount of time could fully exorcise. And these were the experiences that people like Randy couldn't comprehend, wouldn't believe even if she could tell them. A family entered the cafe, bundled against the November cold. The children, 2 boys, perhaps 7 and 9 years old, immediately spotted the display of pastries near the counter and began negotiating with their parents for treats. It was such a normal scene, so beautifully ordinary, that Beatrice felt a sharp pang of something she couldn't quite name. Not quite envy, but perhaps a recognition of all the ordinary moments she had missed during years spent in extraordinary and terrible circumstances. She had never married, never had children of her own. The classified nature of her work had made normal relationships impossible. How could you build intimacy with someone when you couldn't tell them where you'd been or what you'd done? How could you explain the nightmares without revealing the operations that caused them? There had been someone once, briefly. Another operative, a man named David Chen, who had understood because he lived the same reality. They had talked about what might come after, when their service was complete and they could finally build something resembling a normal life. But David had been killed during a mission in 1970, and with him died any remaining hope Beatrice had harbored for a conventional future. After that, she had simply continued. More missions, more years of living in shadows and secrets, until finally, in 1978, when her body began showing the cumulative effects of stress and injury, she had been quietly retired with a modest pension and a firm reminder that everything she had done remained classified. She had moved to Clearwater in 1993, choosing it precisely because it was small and unremarkable, a place where she could fade into the background and live out her remaining years without questions or complications. For 32 years, that strategy had worked. She had become just another elderly resident, noted, if at all, for her quiet demeanor and tendency toward solitude. But moments like this, sitting at the worst table in the cafe while strangers made assumptions about her worth and her past, reminded Beatrice of the fundamental loneliness of her position. She had given years of her life, had sacrificed health and relationships and normalcy for a country that couldn't acknowledge what she had done. She had earned honors that would never be publicly displayed and respect that would never be publicly given. The toast was finished now, though Beatrice barely remembered eating it. The coffee had gone completely cold, a brown liquid that held no appeal whatsoever. She considered simply leaving, abandoning the annual ritual that had become more burden than comfort. Perhaps it was time to let go of this tradition, to stop trying to honor the past in a present that had no place for such remembrances. But even as the thought formed, she dismissed it. Leaving would feel like abandoning Garrett all over again, like saying his sacrifice and the sacrifices of all the others who hadn't made it home didn't matter enough to endure a little discomfort. So Beatrice remained in her assigned seat, back straight despite the uncomfortable chair, hands folded around the cold coffee cup to minimize their trembling. She watched the cafe's activity continue around her, a living current from which she had been deliberately excluded, and she waited. For what? She wasn't entirely sure. Perhaps simply for the morning to end so she could return to her small house and her small life, and the quiet that, while lonely, was at least honest about what it was. The kitchen door opened again, and Beatrice shifted her chair slightly to avoid being hit. The movement sent a jolt of pain through her hip, arthritis adding its complaint to the Parkinson's tremors. She was getting old, undeniably and irreversibly old. And with that aging came an increasing invisibility that no amount of past service could counter. In the window's reflection, she caught a glimpse of herself. A small, elderly woman with white hair and trembling hands, sitting alone at the worst table in the establishment. To anyone looking, she appeared exactly as Randy had described her. Insignificant, barely keeping it together, certainly nothing special. If only they knew. If only they could see past the weathered exterior to the extraordinary history written in scars they would never see and memories they would never share. But they couldn't. And perhaps it was better that way. The weight of knowledge could be its own burden, and Beatrice had learned long ago that some things were better left unspoken.
The bell above the cafe's entrance chimed, a sound that had become background noise to most patrons, but still registered in Beatrice's consciousness as it had throughout her life. Always aware of who entered a space, always tracking potential threats or changes in the environment. Some instincts never faded. The man who entered moved with a distinctive bearing that immediately caught Beatrice's attention. Tall, perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair cut in a precise military style and posture that spoke of decades of discipline. He wore civilian clothes, dark jeans and a well-fitted leather jacket, but everything about his demeanor screamed military service. Not former military, active military, even when off-duty. Colonel Julian Blackwood had entered the Homestead Café with a specific purpose: to grab coffee before his scheduled meeting with the town's mayor regarding a veterans outreach program. He had grown up in Clearwater, left for West Point at 18, and spent 40 years serving in various capacities around the world. Now, semi-retired and working as a consultant, he returned to his hometown several times a year to maintain connections and support local veteran initiatives. Julian's eyes scanned the cafe with practiced efficiency, cataloging exits, assessing the crowd, noting anything unusual. It was automatic, requiring no conscious thought. He had spent too many years in hostile environments to ever fully relax his vigilance, even in a small-town Idaho cafe. He approached the counter, where Iris was taking an order. She glanced up, and something in his bearing made her straighten slightly, responding to an authority she couldn't quite identify, but definitely recognized. "Good morning, sir. What can I get for you?" "Large black coffee. To go," he replied. His voice was deep and measured, carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "And whatever your breakfast special is, I'll take one of those as well." "Coming right up. It'll be just a few minutes." While he waited, Julian turned to survey the cafe more thoroughly. His gaze moved systematically across the space, a lifetime of threat assessment protocols still operational even in this benign setting. Families, business people, groups of friends, all perfectly ordinary. And then his eyes fell on Beatrice. She was tucked into that awkward corner by the kitchen, small and seemingly insignificant. But something made Julian's gaze linger. Perhaps it was the way she held herself despite the uncomfortable setting,
that straight back that suggested military bearing. Perhaps it was the way her eyes tracked movement throughout the cafe with the same awareness he recognized in himself. Or perhaps it was the small portion of her left wrist visible as she reached for her coffee cup, where Julian glimpsed a mark that made his blood run cold. He moved closer, casually, not wanting to alarm her, but needing to confirm what he thought he'd seen. As he approached, passing her table on his way to examine the pastry display nearby, he got a clearer view. There, faded but unmistakable, was the Phantom 7 designation. Julian Blackwood had spent 3 years early in his career studying classified special operations programs, learning from past successes and failures to improve current protocols. Phantom 7 had been legendary even then, a program so secret that most of the files remained sealed decades after the Vietnam War ended. Only a handful of people knew the full scope of what that unit had accomplished. The distinctive tattoo had been shown to him exactly once in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon, as part of a lesson on covert operations protocols. His instructor, a grizzled general who had himself served in Vietnam, had displayed a photograph of the marking with something approaching reverence. If you ever see this designation, you're looking at someone who operated at a level most people can't comprehend. These weren't standard special forces. These were the people we sent when standard special forces couldn't get the job done. And now, impossibly, Julian was looking at that exact marking on the wrist of an elderly woman who had been relegated to the worst table in a small-town cafe. His mind raced through the implications. Phantom 7 had operated from 1966 to 1974, which meant this woman would have been young then, probably in her 20s or early 30s. That aligned with her apparent age now. But women in Phantom 7? Julian had read every declassified file available, and while he knew women had served in Vietnam in various capacities, he had no specific knowledge of women in this particular program.
Which meant her service had been classified at an even higher level than the standard operations. It meant she had been part of something so sensitive that her very existence as an operative had been scrubbed from records he'd been cleared to read. Julian felt something he rarely experienced: genuine awe. He had served alongside some of the finest military professionals in the world, had commanded special operations forces in multiple theaters, had earned decorations for valor that he wore with pride. But if this woman was truly Phantom 7, her service existed in a category beyond his own experience. He approached her table, his heart rate elevated in a way that combat situations rarely achieved anymore. This wasn't fear. This was the recognition that he was in the presence of living history, of someone whose contributions to military doctrine and practice had shaped his own career in ways she would never know. "Excuse me, ma'am," Julian began, his voice respectful, but carrying enough authority that conversations at nearby tables paused. "I couldn't help but notice your marking." Beatrice looked up at him with those pale blue eyes, and for just a moment, Julian saw past the age and the tremors to the operator she must have been. There was an assessment happening, quick and thorough, as she evaluated this stranger who had noticed what everyone else had missed. "It's just an old tattoo," she said quietly, her voice giving nothing away. Decades of operational security weren't easily overcome, even in a situation that posed no actual threat. Julian held her gaze. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel Julian Blackwood, U.S. Army, and that's not just an old tattoo. That's Phantom 7. The words hung in the air between them. Around the cafe, the normal sounds continued. Conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clatter of dishes. But at that small table by the kitchen door, time seemed to pause as two people from different generations of service recognized each other across the years. Beatrice's expression didn't change significantly, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe resignation. The secret she had carried for so long had just been spoken aloud by someone who actually understood what it meant. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. It was the automatic response of someone trained to deny everything, even when denial was pointless.
Julian pulled out the chair across from her without asking permission, sitting down with the unconscious authority of someone who had commanded respect his entire adult life. But when he spoke again, his voice was gentle, almost reverent. "Ma'am, I've studied classified operations for most of my career. I know what that designation means. I know what you must have done, even if I don't know the specific details. And I know—" He glanced around the cafe, his jaw tightening as he took in her isolated position, "that you deserve a hell of a lot better than this." Beatrice studied him for a long moment. She saw sincerity in his face, and more than that, she saw understanding. This wasn't someone who would sensationalize her past or treat her service as a curiosity. This was someone who actually comprehended, at least in part, what Phantom 7 had meant. "It was a long time ago," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and it doesn't matter anymore." "It matters," Julian replied firmly. "It matters more than you know." At the counter, Iris called out that his order was ready. Julian didn't move. "Ma'am, would you allow me to join you for breakfast? I'd be honored to hear whatever you're willing to share." He paused, then added with absolute sincerity, "And I'd like to ensure you're treated with the respect your service deserves." For the first time that morning, something like hope flickered across Beatrice's weathered face. Not hope for recognition or glory, but perhaps hope for something simpler. To be seen, truly seen, by someone who understood what it meant to serve in the shadows.
Julian stood, his movement precise and deliberate, drawing attention without seeming to try. He walked to the counter where Iris stood preparing his order, but his voice carried across the cafe with the projection of someone trained to command in loud environments. "I need to speak with the manager, please." Dennis Hartford emerged from the back office, his expression showing mild concern at the formal tone. "I'm the manager. Is there a problem with your order, sir?" Julian's eyes were steady, his voice calm, but carrying unmistakable authority. "Yes, there's a problem, not with the food, but with how you're treating one of your customers." Dennis glanced around nervously, acutely aware that multiple conversations had stopped as patrons tuned into this unexpected confrontation. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir. We treat all our customers." "The woman you asked to move from her booth to that inadequate table by the kitchen, do you know who she is?" Dennis's expression became defensive. "She's a regular customer who was occupying a 4-person booth when we needed the space for larger parties. It's standard restaurant management." "Standard management," Julian repeated, his voice taking on an edge that made Dennis unconsciously step back. "Let me tell you about standard management. That woman you relocated like an inconvenience, she's a decorated veteran of classified operations that shaped modern military doctrine." The cafe had gone almost completely silent now. Even Randy and his friends at the window table had stopped their conversation, watching this unexpected drama unfold. Julian continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the establishment. "How many of you saw an elderly woman and made assumptions? How many decided she wasn't worth your time or respect based on nothing more than her age and appearance?" Randy had the decency to look uncomfortable, his earlier bravado completely deflated. Mitchell stared at his coffee cup. Derek, who had expressed discomfort with their mockery earlier, looked vindicated, but also troubled by his own failure to speak up more forcefully. A woman in her 60s stood up from a nearby table, her eyes glistening. "My husband served in Vietnam. He never talked about it much, but he always said the quiet ones, the ones who didn't need to prove anything, were the ones who had seen the most." Julian nodded to her respectfully before turning back to Dennis. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Do you believe that woman deserves to sit at the worst table in your establishment on Veterans Day, the one day of the year specifically designated to honor people like her?" Dennis's face had gone pale. The realization of what he had done, the implications for his business if this story got out, crashed over him like a wave. "Sir, I sincerely apologize. I had no idea. If Miss Thornwood would allow it, I'd like to—" "It's not me you need to apologize to. And before you do, I want everyone in this cafe to understand something. The respect we're about to show this woman isn't special treatment. It's not because someone with a military rank is demanding it.
It's simply what should have been offered from the beginning.
He walked back to Beatrice's table, and in a gesture that stunned everyone watching, Colonel Julian Blackwood, a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers and conducted operations on multiple continents, came to attention and delivered a crisp, formal salute. "Ma'am, your service and sacrifice honor us all. I apologize that it took someone like me to ensure you received the recognition you deserve." Beatrice looked up at this man, this stranger, who had transformed her morning of quiet humiliation into something entirely different. Tears that she had held back for decades threatened to surface, but she maintained her composure with the same iron will that had gotten her through missions in hostile territory. "At ease, Colonel," she said softly, and there was something in her voice now, a trace of the authority she had once wielded. "And thank you." Julian remained standing, his presence a physical statement that he wouldn't sit until the situation was properly resolved. He looked at Dennis, who was hovering uncertainly nearby. "Mr. Hartford, I believe you have something to say." Dennis approached Beatrice's table and, to his credit, when he spoke, his voice carried genuine remorse. "Miss Thornwood, I owe you a sincere apology. My actions this morning were disrespectful and wrong. I should have treated you with the dignity you deserve from the moment you entered my establishment. Please allow me to offer you our best table and a full breakfast, with my compliments." "And," Julian prompted, his tone suggesting there was more to be said. Dennis swallowed hard. "And I assure you that you will always be welcome here, at any table you choose, at any time. It would be an honor to serve you." Beatrice studied both men for a long moment. Part of her wanted to simply leave, to escape the sudden spotlight and return to the anonymity she had cultivated so carefully. But another part, a part she had suppressed for too long, recognized that this moment meant something beyond her own discomfort. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Hartford," she said finally, "but I don't need the best table or special treatment. I simply wanted to have my coffee and remember a friend who didn't make it home. That's all I've ever wanted." Julian's respect for her grew even deeper. Here was a woman being offered compensation and public recognition, and she was declining it with grace, keeping the focus on service rather than on herself. "Nevertheless," Julian said gently, "perhaps you would allow me to join you for breakfast. Not as an obligation, but because I would genuinely value the opportunity to hear about your experiences, whatever you're comfortable sharing." Before Beatrice could respond, Iris appeared with fresh coffee and a menu. "Miss Thornwood, whatever you'd like, it's on the house today. And I'm sorry, too, for not standing up for you earlier." Around the cafe, something remarkable was happening. One by one, patrons were standing up. Not in any organized way, but spontaneously, moved by what they had witnessed and by the realization of their own blindness. They weren't applauding or making speeches. They were simply standing in silent acknowledgement of someone whose service they had failed to recognize. The woman whose husband had served in Vietnam was crying openly now. An elderly man in a VFW cap stood at attention, his salute sharp despite arthritic joints. Even the high school students by the counter had risen, sensing that something important was happening even if they didn't fully understand the context. Beatrice looked around at this unexpected gathering of respect, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, acknowledged not for seeking attention, but for finally having her quiet dignity recognized. "Colonel Blackwood," she said, her voice stronger now, "I would be honored to share breakfast with you." Julian helped Beatrice gather her belongings from the cramped table by the kitchen, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about his character. He didn't make a show of it, didn't draw unnecessary attention to her difficulty in rising from the uncomfortable metal chair. He simply offered his arm with quiet dignity, and she accepted it with equal grace. Dennis personally escorted them to the corner booth Beatrice had originally occupied, the one with the comfortable bench seating and the window view of Main Street with its Veterans Day flags. Several patrons had to be relocated to accommodate this move, but none of them complained. The atmosphere in the cafe had fundamentally shifted from casual indifference to something approaching reverence. As they settled into the booth, Iris appeared immediately with fresh coffee and water. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured, still processing the revelation of who Beatrice truly was. "Miss Thornwood, I've been serving you for almost 2 years, and I never knew. I'm so sorry for how you were treated today." Beatrice wrapped her weathered hands around the warm coffee mug, feeling the heat seep into her arthritic joints. "You've always been kind to me, Iris. That's all that ever mattered. But I should have done more. I should have stood up to Dennis when he asked you to move. I knew it was wrong." Julian interjected gently. "Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to give people the courage to act on what they already know is right. Don't be too hard on yourself." Randy approached their table then, his earlier confidence completely absent. He stood awkwardly, hands shoved in his pockets, looking like a man who desperately wished he could be anywhere else. But to his credit, he didn't flee from the consequences of his words. "Ma'am," he began, his voice rough with genuine shame, "I owe you an apology, a big one. The things I said earlier, the assumptions I made, they were ignorant and disrespectful. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Beatrice looked up at this man who had mocked her just 30 minutes earlier. She could see the genuine remorse in his expression, the uncomfortable recognition of his own prejudice. She had a choice in how to respond. She could let him suffer, could make him feel the full weight of his casual cruelty, or she could offer the grace that years of service had taught her was often more powerful than punishment. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "We all make assumptions based on incomplete information. The important thing is what we do when we realize we were wrong." Randy nodded, clearly relieved but still troubled. "My father really did serve in Vietnam. He never talked about it much before he died. Now I wonder what I missed by not asking more questions, by not looking deeper. Many veterans don't talk about their service. Sometimes the memories are too painful. Sometimes the experiences are too difficult to translate into words civilians would understand. Your father's silence doesn't diminish what he did." Mitchell and Derek had approached as well, standing slightly behind Randy. Mitchell spoke up, his voice subdued. "Ma'am, I made some pretty crude comments about women in the military. I was speaking from ignorance and prejudice, and I apologize. The military has evolved significantly regarding women's roles," Julian interjected, though his tone remained respectful rather than lecturing. But even in eras when official policy limited women's participation, there were always exceptional individuals who served in ways that weren't publicly acknowledged. Ms. Thornwood was one of those pioneers. Derek, who had been the most uncomfortable with his friend's mockery, stepped forward. "Ms. Thornwood, I should have spoken up earlier. I knew what they were saying was wrong, but I stayed quiet. That makes me complicit, and I'm sorry." Beatrice studied the 3 men standing before her like chastened schoolboys. They were roughly the same age Garrett would have been if he had lived. That thought softened her further. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your apologies, but I also want you to understand something. I'm not special. There were thousands of people who served in various capacities during that war, many of whom never received recognition or thanks. The next time you see someone who appears ordinary, remember that you might be looking at someone with an extraordinary history you can't see." The men nodded and returned to their table, their earlier boisterous conversation replaced by subdued reflection. The entire cafe had taken on a different character, as if Julian's intervention had opened everyone's eyes to their own casual dismissals and assumptions. An elderly couple approached next, the man moving slowly with a walker. He wore a VFW cap with Vietnam War veterans patches, and his wife held his arm supportively. "Young lady," he said, using a term that would have seemed patronizing in any other context, but somehow felt right coming from someone in his 80s. "I'm Tom Hargrove. I served with the 101st Airborne in 68 and 69. I never heard of Phantom 7, but if the colonel here says you were elite, then you were elite. Thank you for your service." Beatrice felt emotion tightening her throat. "Thank you for yours, Mr. Hargrove." His wife spoke up, her voice warm. "We come here every week, and I've seen you on Veterans Day for the past several years. I always wondered why you sat alone. Now I understand you were remembering someone special." "My brother," Beatrice confirmed quietly. "Garrett Thornwood. He didn't make it home." Tom Hargrove stood a bit straighter despite his walker. "Then we honor him too. Every man and woman who didn't come back deserves to be remembered." As the couple returned to their table, Julian leaned forward slightly. "You mentioned your brother. Was he also Phantom 7? Beatrice nodded. "He recruited me, actually. Garrett was one of the founding members of the unit. When they were looking for operatives with specific skill sets, he suggested me. I think he wanted to keep an eye on his little sister, though he'd never admit it. He must have been proud of you." "He was, until the end. He died getting me out of a compromised extraction, pushed me toward the helicopter, and stayed behind to provide covering fire." Beatrice's hands trembled more noticeably now, though whether from Parkinson's or emotion was impossible to tell. "His last words were to tell our mother he loved her." Julian remained silent for a moment, respecting the weight of that memory. Then he said, "The protocols that came out of Phantom 7, the extraction techniques and intelligence-gathering methods, they've saved thousands of lives in subsequent conflicts. Your brother's sacrifice and your service created a legacy that extends far beyond that one moment." Sheriff Patricia Brennan entered the cafe then, drawn by a phone call from a concerned citizen who had witnessed the earlier confrontation and wanted to ensure there was no trouble. She was in her late 50s, a former Army MP who had served in Desert Storm before returning to Clearwater and eventually being elected sheriff. She spotted Julian's distinctive bearing immediately and made her way to their table. "Colonel Blackwood, I heard there was some kind of situation here. Everything all right?" Julian gestured to Beatrice. "Sheriff, let me introduce you to someone remarkable. This is Beatrice Thornwood, formerly of Phantom 7. Patricia's eyes widened in instant recognition. "Phantom 7? The classified unit?" She looked at Beatrice with newfound respect. "Ma'am, I studied your unit's protocols at military police school. They taught us that Phantom 7 revolutionized how we think about covert extraction and civilian population intelligence gathering." "You're the sheriff here?" Beatrice asked, slightly stunned at this connection. "For 12 years now, and I wish I had known sooner who you were. We have a veterans support network in town that could have connected you with other people who understand what you've been through." Beatrice smiled faintly. "I've preferred to keep to myself, Sheriff. Old habits from a lifetime of classified work." "I understand," Patricia replied, "but if you ever change your mind, we'd be honored to have you involved. We need voices like yours, people who can speak to experiences that most civilians never knew existed." As Patricia departed, promising to check in with Beatrice soon, Dennis approached with 2 plates of food. Not the simple toast Beatrice had ordered, but full breakfast plates with eggs, bacon, hash browns, and fresh fruit. "Please, on the house. And Miss Thornwood, I meant what I said earlier. You're always welcome here." Julian raised his coffee cup. To service, sacrifice, and the recognition that should never have to be demanded, but always should be given. Beatrice touched her cup to his, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. A sense of belonging, of being seen and valued for who she truly was rather than what she appeared to be.
As they began eating, the cafe gradually returned to its normal rhythm, though the atmosphere remained noticeably different. Conversations were quieter, more respectful. People glanced occasionally at Beatrice and Julian's table, but with curiosity and respect rather than judgment. Iris refilled their coffee, then hesitated by the table. "Miss Thornwood, can I ask you something? It's personal, so please tell me if I'm overstepping." Beatrice nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, dear." "You mentioned your brother earlier. His name was Garrett Thornwood?" When Beatrice confirmed, Iris continued, "My grandmother's maiden name was Thornwood. She grew up somewhere in the Midwest, Kansas, I think, before moving out here in the 1970s. She passed away 5 years ago, but she had a brother who died in Vietnam. She never talked about him much, but I remember seeing an old photograph in her house of a young soldier." Beatrice's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "What was your grandmother's name?"
Dorothy Thornwood before she married. She became Dorothy Chen. The cafe seemed to tilt slightly around Beatrice. Dorothy, her sister, the baby of the family who had only been 16 when Garrett died, who had written letters to both her siblings throughout their deployments, who had moved away after the war and gradually lost touch with Beatrice as the years and distance accumulated between them. "Dorothy was my sister," Beatrice said, her voice barely audible. "That would make you my great niece." Iris's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Your Aunt Bee? Grandma Dorothy talked about you sometimes, but we thought you had died years ago. She tried to find you after the war, but she said it was like you disappeared." "I did disappear, in a way," Beatrice admitted. "My work required it. By the time I was free to reconnect, so many years had passed. I assumed Dorothy had moved on with her life and wouldn't want reminders of that painful time." Julian watched this reunion unfold with quiet amazement, recognizing the profound significance of this moment. This wasn't just about military service being recognized. This was about family connections lost to time and circumstance being unexpectedly restored. "I have photographs," Iris said excitedly, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. "Mom kept all of Grandma's old pictures. There are photos of you and Uncle Garrett together. I've looked at them dozens of times, never knowing I was looking at my own family." She scrolled through her phone, then turned it to show Beatrice an image. It was a scan of an old photograph showing 3 children standing in front of a farmhouse. A tall boy, of perhaps 15, with an easy grin, a girl of about 12 with serious eyes and dark braided hair, and a little girl of maybe 6, holding the older girl's hand. Beatrice stared at the image, memories flooding back with overwhelming force. That farmhouse in Kansas where they had grown up, the summer day that photograph had been taken, just before Garrett left for his first year of college, the feeling of her little sister's hand in hers, sticky from the popsicle she'd been eating. "I remember that day," Beatrice whispered. "Dorothy had gotten into the blackberry bushes and stained her dress. Mother was furious, but Garrett convinced her to take the photo anyway. He said we should remember ourselves as we really were, not posed and perfect." Iris was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears. "Grandma kept that photo by her bedside until she died. She used to say that was the last time all 3 of them were together and happy, before the war changed everything." "Your grandmother, how was her life? Was she happy?" Beatrice asked, needing to know that at least one of the Thornwood siblings had found peace. "She was," Iris assured her. "She married my grandfather, Thomas Chen, in 1972. He was kind and patient with her grief. They had 2 children, my mother and my uncle. She worked as a librarian for 40 years and was beloved in her community. She had a good life, but she never stopped missing her brother and sister." The name Chen suddenly resonated with Julian. Thomas Chen. Was he military? Iris nodded. "Marines, I think. He died when I was very young, so I don't remember him well." Beatrice's hands had gone still, her food forgotten. "Thomas Chen. I knew a Thomas Chen in Vietnam. He was a communications specialist, attached to various special operations units. We worked together on several missions." "That's him!" Iris exclaimed. "Grandma said they met at a veterans support group in 1971. She was there supporting her lost brother, and Grandpa was there dealing with his own service experiences. They bonded over shared loss and understanding."
Beatrice felt the weight of connections and coincidences, the way lives intersected in patterns too complex to be merely random. Thomas Chen had been one of the good ones, a man whose skill with communications equipment had been matched by his compassion and steady temperament. She remembered him clearly now, remembered conversations during rare downtime where he had mentioned his hope to find someone who understood what he had been through. "Thomas was a fine man," Beatrice said. "If Dorothy married him, then she chose well. I'm glad she found someone who understood." Julian had been listening to this exchange with growing appreciation for how interconnected the military community truly was. It's remarkable how these connections persist across generations, how the bonds formed during service continue to matter decades later.
Grandma Dorothy tried to find you, Iris said again, her voice thick with emotion. She wrote letters to the Veterans Administration, checked with the Red Cross, even hired a private investigator in the 1980s, but there was no record of you anywhere she looked. Phantom 7 records were classified at a level that made us essentially invisible, Beatrice explained. Even our service records were sealed or destroyed. It was necessary for operational security, but it meant people like your grandmother couldn't find us, even when they wanted to. Iris pulled out a chair and sat down, her professional duties momentarily forgotten in the face of this extraordinary discovery. She would have been so happy to know you were alive, that you were here. Would you mind if I showed you more pictures? And if you could tell me about her and Uncle Garrett, the things Grandma couldn't talk about? Beatrice reached across the table and took Iris's hand, her trembling fingers gripping the young woman's steady ones. I would love that. And I can tell you that your grandmother, even at 16, was one of the bravest people I knew. When Garrett died, she wrote me a letter. I still have it, kept in a box of things too precious to throw away. She told me that she understood why we had to serve, that she was proud of us both, and that she would carry Garrett's memory forward so he would never be forgotten. She did, Iris confirmed, tears streaming down her face. She told her children and grandchildren about Uncle Garrett. We knew his name, knew he died serving his country, knew he was a hero. Because of her, he was never forgotten in our family. Julian discreetly signaled to Dennis, ensuring that Iris wouldn't face any repercussions for taking this time away from her duties. This moment was too important, too meaningful, to be interrupted by concerns about restaurant efficiency. Your grandmother wrote about you too, Iris continued, in her journals, which Mom inherited. She wrote about hoping her sister Beatrice had found peace somewhere, that wherever you were, you knew you were loved and remembered. Beatrice had not cried when Garrett died. She had not cried at her own mother's funeral, or when she learned that Dorothy had passed away before she had found the courage to reach out. But now, hearing that her baby sister had spent decades hoping for her well-being, had never stopped loving her despite the years in silence, the tears came. They fell quietly, these tears that carried 50 years of isolation, grief, and unspoken love. Julian pretended to be very interested in his breakfast, giving the two women privacy in this public space. Around them, other patrons who had been watching maintained their respectful distance, understanding that something profound was happening. She loved you, Iris said simply, and now I've found you and we're family, and you don't have to be alone anymore. Beatrice squeezed Iris's hand, unable to speak through the emotion constricting her throat. She had come to this cafe to honor Garrett's memory in solitude, as she had done for so many years. Instead, she had found something she thought was lost forever: family, connection, and the knowledge that she had never been as forgotten as she had believed.
After Iris returned to her duties, though with frequent glances back at their table and promises to bring her mother to meet Beatrice soon, Julian and Beatrice sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The breakfast that had started in humiliation had transformed into something neither of them could have anticipated. That was extraordinary, Julian finally said. Finding family after all these years? I thought I was alone, Beatrice replied, her voice still rough with emotion. After Dorothy passed away, I thought the Thornwood line ended with me. Now I discover I have family that never knew I existed. Julian poured more coffee for both of them, a simple gesture that felt companionable rather than servile. If you're willing, I'd like to hear more about your service. Not the classified details, but the experience of being Phantom 7. It's rare to meet someone who operated at that level. Beatrice considered for a moment. Decades of operational security had trained her to deflect such questions, to maintain the silence that had protected her and her unit. But sitting here with this man who genuinely understood the context, who had studied her unit's contributions and respected what they had meant, she felt the constraints loosening. What do you want to know? How did you end up in Phantom 7? Women in combat roles were virtually unheard of then, especially in special operations. Beatrice smiled faintly at the memory.
I didn't set out to be a soldier. I was studying languages at the University of Kansas, Vietnamese and French, when Garrett came home on leave in 1965. He was already part of something he couldn't talk about, but he asked me questions about cultural adaptation, about blending into local populations, about the psychology of trust. She paused, organizing thoughts that had been private for so long. A month later, I was contacted by someone who identified himself only as a State Department official. He asked if I'd be willing to serve my country in a capacity that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. I was 23 years old, idealistic, and my brother had already proven himself in service. I said yes. Did you know what you were getting into? Not at first. The training was unlike anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just physical, though that was brutal enough. They trained us to think differently, to assess situations from multiple angles simultaneously, to make decisions with incomplete information under extreme stress. Beatrice's eyes had taken on a distant quality, seeing past the cafe to memories stored deep. By the time I understood what I had committed to, I was already too far in to back out. And honestly, I didn't want to. Julian leaned forward, genuinely fascinated. The files I've read about Phantom 7 mention unconventional extraction protocols. Were you part of developing those? Garrett and I worked on them together. Traditional extraction methods assumed certain constants: reliable communication, predictable enemy positions, extraction zones that could be secured in advance, but our missions rarely offered those luxuries. Beatrice's hands, despite their tremor, gestured as she spoke, muscle memory of briefings given decades ago. The Ellis-Thornwood bypass? That's named after your brother? And me, though officially my name was scrubbed from the documentation. The protocol was designed for situations where the primary extraction point was compromised. Instead of aborting or holding position, which often resulted in casualties, we developed a dynamic routing system. The team would continuously move toward alternating secondary points while the extraction craft adapted its approach based on real-time intelligence. She took a sip of coffee, the warmth grounding her in the present as she discussed the past. The first time we used it operationally, we were extracting a South Vietnamese intelligence asset from a village that had been overrun faster than anticipated. The primary extraction zone was under heavy fire, the secondary was being shelled, and our tertiary option had been mined. We ended up creating a fourth option on the fly, using terrain features that weren't on our maps, but that I had observed during infiltration. And it worked? We got the asset out along with all 7 team members, 0 casualties. The protocol was immediately adopted for training purposes. Beatrice's expression grew more somber, but it wasn't always successful. The mission where Garrett died, we were using a modified version of the protocol. Everything was going according to plan until the second helicopter was hit. The protocol couldn't account for equipment failure at that specific moment.
Julian nodded respectfully. No protocol can eliminate all risk, but the ones your team developed reduced casualties significantly across multiple subsequent operations. That's documented, even in the limited files available. I know. It's some comfort, knowing that our work saved others, but it doesn't bring back the people we lost. Beatrice looked out the window at the Veterans Day flags. Garrett, Thomas Chen, Maria Santos, David Nguyen, and 9 others over the years. All of them deserve to come home. You carry them with you, Julian observed. All of them. Every day. Their faces are clearer to me now than faces of people I met last week. Sometimes I wonder if that's a blessing or a curse. Perhaps both, Julian suggested. The weight of memory is heavy, but forgetting would be worse. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, 2 people from different generations of service finding common ground in shared understanding. The cafe continued its morning business around them, but at their table existed a pocket of mutual respect and recognition. "Can I ask you something?" Beatrice said. "Why did you intervene this morning? You could have simply gotten your coffee and left. Many people would have." Julian considered the question carefully. Because I was taught that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It's a commitment to values that persist regardless of what you're wearing or where you are. When I saw how you were being treated and then recognized what that tattoo meant, walking away would have been a betrayal of everything I believe about honor and respect. He paused, then continued. But there's more to it than that. My first commanding officer, when I was a green second lieutenant, told me something I've never forgotten. He said the true test of character isn't how you treat people who can help you or who have obvious power. It's how you treat people who appear to have neither. You appeared to be just an elderly woman alone in a cafe, but even without knowing your history, you deserved better treatment than you received. Your commanding officer sounds like he was a wise man. He was, Colonel Richard Chen. Beatrice's cup paused midway to her lips. Chen? Any relation to Thomas? His son. Colonel Chen retired 5 years ago, but he's the one who first showed me the Phantom 7 designation during a classified briefing. He said his father had worked with some of the finest operators he ever knew, and that one of them had helped his mother heal after the war. The connections continued to multiply, threads of history weaving together in patterns that seemed almost impossible. Thomas Chen's son had become the officer who taught Julian about Phantom 7, creating a direct line of knowledge and respect that had ultimately led to this moment. The world is smaller than we think, Beatrice said softly. Or perhaps the military community is just deeply interconnected in ways we don't always recognize. Can I contact Colonel Chen, if you're comfortable with that? I think he'd want to know that I met you, that his father's work and your work are still being honored. Beatrice nodded slowly. I'd like that. It's strange, after so many years of silence, to suddenly have these connections reopening. Part of me wants to retreat back into privacy, but another part, a part I'd almost forgotten existed, wants to embrace these links to the past. You don't have to decide today, Julian assured her, but I hope you'll at least consider staying connected, not just with me, but with your family, with others who understand what you've been through. Isolation is a slow poison, and you've carried enough burdens alone. Beatrice looked at this man who had, in the span of an hour, transformed her entire morning, and perhaps her entire future. You're very perceptive, Colonel. Julian, please. And I've simply learned to recognize what I've seen in too many veterans, including myself. The tendency to withdraw, to carry everything privately, to assume no one can understand. It's a common response to extraordinary experiences, but it doesn't have to be permanent. Outside, the morning sun had broken through the clouds, casting warm light across the cafe. The breakfast rush was beginning to subside, and the atmosphere had settled into something peaceful. At their table, Beatrice felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope for a future that might include connection rather than solitude.
The days following that Veterans Day morning brought changes to Beatrice's life that she could never have anticipated. Julian had been true to his word, contacting Colonel Richard Chen, who had immediately requested permission to visit Clearwater and meet the woman who had worked alongside his father. Their meeting took place at Beatrice's modest home on Birch Avenue, a small two-bedroom house that she had kept meticulously organized, another remnant of military discipline. Colonel Chen, now in his 60s with his father's pined eyes and steady demeanor, had brought photographs and letters that Thomas had written home during his service. My father spoke highly of the operators he worked with, Richard said, sitting in Beatrice's living room with coffee and the comfortable ease of military people recognizing kinship. He never mentioned names because of classification, but he described a woman who could navigate impossible situations with calm precision. I believe he was talking about you. Beatrice held one of the photographs, a young Thomas Chen smiling beside communications equipment in a jungle setting. Your father saved my life during a mission in 1969. Our radio equipment had been damaged, and we were cut off from extraction support. Thomas jury-rigged a transmitter using components from 3 different damaged units. Without his ingenuity, we would never have made it out. That sounds like him. He could fix anything.
Richard smiled at the memory. After the war, he became a television repairman. Neighbors would bring him equipment other technicians had declared hopeless, and he'd somehow get it working again. He married my sister, Dorothy, Beatrice said. I only learned recently that they had found each other. Iris, my great-niece, told me. Richard's expression showed surprise, and then understanding. So we're connected through marriage as well as service. My father would have appreciated that symmetry. He believed that the bonds formed during service created families that extended beyond blood. The connection with Richard Chen opened other doors. He introduced Beatrice to a network of veterans from multiple generations, people who understood the unique challenges of classified service and the difficulty of carrying secrets that couldn't be shared. She found herself, hesitantly at first, attending monthly gatherings where veterans could talk freely about the weight of service without feeling pressured to reveal specific details. Iris became a regular visitor, bringing her mother, Linda, who wept when meeting the aunt she had never known existed. Linda brought boxes of family photographs and documents, pieces of Thornwood family history that Beatrice had thought lost forever. Mom kept everything, Linda explained, spreading photographs across Beatrice's dining table. She said family history was precious and needed to be preserved. Look, here's your mother and father on their wedding day. And this one is you and Uncle Garrett with Dorothy, probably from the early 1960s. Beatrice touched the images with trembling fingers, seeing her younger self looking back with an earnestness and hope that the coming years would test beyond measure. I didn't have any photographs from before the war. I left everything behind when I joined Phantom 7, and when I returned, the house had been sold and most possessions distributed among relatives I'd lost touch with. Well, now you have copies of everything, Linda said warmly. We're family, and family preserves these memories together. The transformation in how Beatrice was treated at the Homestead Café was immediate and lasting. Dennis Hartford, genuinely remorseful about his earlier behavior, had placed a small plaque near the entrance. We honor all who served, with special recognition for those whose service remains classified. Thank you for your sacrifice. Beatrice's corner booth became informally known as her table, though she never requested or expected such treatment. Other patrons, learning her story through the small-town network that made privacy nearly impossible, would occasionally stop by to thank her or simply nod respectfully as they passed. Randy, Mitchell, and Derek made a point of apologizing again when they next saw her, and Randy in particular seemed transformed by the experience. He began volunteering with the local veterans organization. His earlier ignorance converted into genuine commitment to supporting those who had served. I was so wrong about so much, he told Beatrice during one encounter at the cafe. I'm trying to do better, to look deeper, to not make assumptions based on what I think I see. That's all any of us can do, Beatrice replied. Recognize our mistakes and commit to growing from them. Sheriff Patricia Brennan recruited Beatrice to speak at the local high school about service and sacrifice. Beatrice initially resisted, uncomfortable with public attention, but Patricia was persuasive.
These kids need to hear from someone real, Patricia argued. Not a Hollywood version of military service, but the truth about what it means to serve, especially from someone who broke barriers when women in combat were officially non-existent. The presentation at Clearwater High School drew not just students, but community members, filling the auditorium beyond capacity. Beatrice stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of expectant faces, and felt her old training reassert itself. She had briefed teams before dangerous missions. Surely she could talk to students about her experiences. She spoke for 30 minutes, carefully navigating around classified details while conveying the essence of what Phantom 7 had meant. She talked about service as a commitment to something larger than oneself, about the bonds formed with people from different backgrounds united by common purpose, about sacrifice not as abstract concept, but as daily choices that accumulated into years of missed birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that most people took for granted. I missed my sister Dorothy's high school graduation because I was on a mission I couldn't discuss. I missed my mother's final years because the nature of my service required distance from family.
These weren't dramatic sacrifices made in a single moment. They were quiet losses that accumulated over time. The cost of choosing service over personal comfort. She paused, looking at the young faces watching her with rapt attention. I don't tell you this to discourage anyone from serving. I tell you this so you understand that service requires genuine sacrifice. And I tell you that despite everything I missed, despite the losses and the loneliness, and the years spent carrying secrets, I would make the same choice again. Because what we did mattered. The people we saved, the intelligence we gathered, the protocols we developed that are still saving lives today. That legacy makes the sacrifice meaningful. The standing ovation that followed surprised her. These young people, born decades after Vietnam, responding to her story with genuine emotion and respect. Several students approached afterward with questions, and Beatrice found herself energized by their curiosity and thoughtfulness. Julian, who had attended the presentation, waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. You're a natural speaker. Have you considered doing more of this? I never thought of myself as someone who should be speaking publicly. Maybe that's exactly why you should. You're not seeking glory or attention, you're simply sharing truth, and people respond to that authenticity. Word of Beatrice's presentation spread beyond Clearwater. She received invitations to speak at veterans events throughout Idaho and neighboring states. Some she accepted, others she declined, learning to balance her newfound visibility with her need for privacy and quiet. The most meaningful invitation came from the Naval Special Warfare Command. They requested her participation in a classified briefing where current operators could learn directly from someone who had pioneered techniques they still used. Beatrice accepted, finding it deeply satisfying to know that her experiences could continue to serve a practical purpose. During that visit, she met young operators who reminded her of Garrett and the others who hadn't made it home. Their intensity, their commitment, their willingness to operate in the shadows without public recognition, all of it echoed the values that had defined Phantom 7. Your protocols saved my team last year, one young SEAL told her during a break. We were in a situation where everything went sideways, and the Ellis Thornwood bypass gave us options we wouldn't have had otherwise. 4 of us made it home because of what you developed 50 years ago. These moments, hearing how her work continued to matter, brought Beatrice a sense of completion she hadn't known she needed. The isolation and silence of the past decades began to feel less like abandonment and more like a bridge between past service and present impact. Back in Clearwater, Iris introduced Beatrice to her children, Emma, age 7, and Jacob, age 9. The children, initially shy around their elderly great-great-aunt, gradually warmed to her gentle presence and the fascinating stories she could tell about a world they had only read about in history books. Great Aunt B, were you scared during the missions? Emma asked during one visit, her young face serious with curiosity. Beatrice considered the question carefully. Yes, often. But fear is natural. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. These small moments, teaching another generation about service and sacrifice, felt like completing a circle that had been broken when Garrett died and Dorothy moved away.
3 years after that transformative Veterans Day morning, Beatrice Thornwood passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 82. The Parkinson's disease that had slowly diminished her physical capabilities finally claimed her body, though her mind remained sharp until the end. The funeral at Clearwater Community Church drew hundreds of people. Active-duty military personnel in dress uniforms stood alongside local residents who had known Beatrice only in her final years. Julian Blackwood, now fully retired, delivered the eulogy with the same dignity and respect he had shown her during their first meeting. Beatrice Thornwood lived 2 lives, Julian told the gathered mourners.
The first was in shadows and silence, conducting operations that saved countless lives but could never be publicly acknowledged. The second was here, in Clearwater, where she finally found the community and recognition she had earned decades earlier. Both lives were marked by the same qualities: courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to something larger than herself. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. When I met Bea 3 years ago, she was sitting alone at the worst table in a cafe, dismissed and overlooked. But she bore that indignity with the same grace she had borne all the hardships of her extraordinary life. She never demanded recognition or special treatment. She simply lived with quiet dignity, carrying memories and sacrifices that few could comprehend. Iris spoke next, representing the family that had been reunited through that chance encounter. Great Aunt Bea gave our family a gift we didn't know we needed. She gave us connection to our history, stories about my grandmother Dorothy and great uncle Garrett that had been lost to time. She taught my children about service and sacrifice not through grand speeches, but through the simple example of how she lived. She held up a photograph, the same one showing 3 Thornwood siblings on that long-ago summer day. This picture hung in my grandmother's house my entire childhood. For years, I looked at these 3 faces without knowing I was looking at my own family. Now this picture hangs in my home, and my children know their history. They know about Garrett, who gave his life for his country. They know about Dorothy, who carried that loss with grace and built a beautiful life despite her grief. And they know about Beatrice, who served in ways that couldn't be spoken about, but that changed the course of history. The military honors that followed included a rifle salute and the presentation of an American flag. But, more significantly, a representative from the Naval Special Warfare Command presented a classified commendation that acknowledged Beatrice's contributions to operational protocols that continued to save lives decades after her service ended. The Ellis-Thornwood bypass and related extraction protocols have been credited with 0 casualty extractions in over 200 operations since their implementation, the representative stated. Beatrice Thornwood's service extended far beyond her years in uniform. Her legacy lives on in every operator who makes it home safely using the techniques she pioneered. The headstone placed at her grave was simple, at her own request stated in her will. Beatrice Thornwood, 1943-2028, Phantom 7. She served in silence so others could live in peace. But beside her name, the distinctive tattoo symbol was etched in stone, ensuring that those who knew would always recognize what she had been. In the months following her death, the impact of Beatrice's story continued to ripple outward. The Homestead Café, working with Iris and Linda, created a small memorial corner with photographs of Beatrice and information about Phantom 7. The display included the original booth where she had been relegated that Veterans Day morning, now marked with a plaque, "Reserved for those who served in silence." Dennis Hartford, still managing the cafe, made it a policy that any veteran, regardless of appearance or circumstance, would be offered the best available seating and treated with unwavering respect. "We learned an important lesson that day," he told a local reporter, "that we never know what extraordinary histories the ordinary-looking people around us might be carrying."
The Clearwater High School, where Beatrice had given her first public presentation, established the Thornwood Scholarship for students pursuing military service or careers supporting veterans. The first recipient was a young woman who cited Beatrice's presentation as the inspiration for her decision to join the Army. Julian Blackwood wrote a book, approved through proper channels and carefully navigated around classified information, about the impact of shadow operations on modern military doctrine. An entire chapter was dedicated to Phantom 7 and the protocols that had emerged from that unit's experiences. While he couldn't name most of the operatives due to ongoing classification, he could name Beatrice, and he did so with the reverence her service deserved. She was proof, Julian wrote in the book's conclusion, that the most important contributions are often made by people who never seek recognition. Beatrice Thornwood could have spent her final years bitter about the decades of silence and isolation her service had required. Instead, she embraced the connections that finally came her way and used her remaining time to teach others about the true meaning of sacrifice. Colonel Richard Chen continued to honor his father's memory and his connection to Beatrice by mentoring young operators and emphasizing the importance of the support personnel who enabled special operations to succeed. My father was a communications specialist, and Beatrice Thornwood was an operator, but they shared a commitment to mission success over personal glory. That ethos of service over self is what we must preserve. Iris kept Beatrice's house largely as it had been, occasionally bringing her children to visit and remember their great-great-aunt. Emma and Jacob, now older and more aware of what their relative had accomplished, took pride in their connection to this quiet hero. On the anniversary of that pivotal Veterans Day, the town of Clearwater began an annual tradition. Community members would gather at the Homestead Café for breakfast, and someone, often Julian when he was in town, sometimes Iris, sometimes Sheriff Brennan, would tell Beatrice's story to ensure new residents and younger generations understood the extraordinary woman who had lived among them. The story always ended the same way, with a reminder that heroes often look nothing like what we expect. They might be the elderly person sitting alone in a cafe, the quiet neighbor who never talks about their past, the unassuming individual whose appearance gives no hint of the extraordinary life they've lived. Look deeper became the unofficial motto of these gatherings. Honor everyone, because you never know what sacrifices the person next to you might have made. Years after Beatrice's death, when the full Phantom 7 files were finally declassified as part of a broader transparency initiative, military historians discovered details that even Julian hadn't known. Beatrice had conducted 23 classified missions, not the 17 that had been in the limited files. She had been recommended for the Medal of Honor twice, though the recommendations were classified and never processed through normal channels. She had trained over 40 subsequent operatives in extraction protocols before her retirement. The revelations prompted a formal ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery where a memorial was dedicated to the members of Phantom 7. Beatrice's name was prominently displayed, along with Garrett's and the others who had served in that shadowy unit. Iris and her family attended, representing a woman who had lived most of her life in obscurity, but whose legacy had finally received its due recognition. As the ceremony concluded and attendees filed past the memorial, touching the names etched on stone, a young Navy SEAL paused at Beatrice's name. He had used the Ellis Thornwood bypass just 3 months ago in an operation that had brought his entire team home safely. He placed his hand on her name and whispered, "Thank you." It was a simple gesture, but it embodied everything Beatrice had wanted. Not glory or public acclaim, but the knowledge that her service had mattered, that the sacrifices had meaning, and that the lives saved justified the years spent in the shadows. The wind rustled through the trees of Arlington, carrying with it the weight of history and the promise that some sacrifices, even those made in silence, would never be forgotten.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.